My objectives are very simple. I'm going to talk to you about our campaign, key partners, stakeholders, and I'm not going to read these verbatim, grassroots, barriers, and finally lessons learned. And that was the verbiage that was given to us by Texas, so I want to credit them for that. And so the 10 lessons that I share came from them first. This is a very personal kind of talk for me. I'm a native of rural northeast Nebraska. I understand access to care, and when the dust clears, that's what we're talking about, is access to care. My parents drive 40 minutes for basic health care services. My sister is an EMT with the local rescue squad, and when she gets the call at 3 a.m. in the morning to go, she asks, which direction? She lives 6 miles south of town. Are you going? Because sometimes it's faster for her to go to where the call is rather than to make them wait in town for her to call and jump on the squad and ride with them. I have 6 nephews. I'm the oldest of 6. I have 6 nephews who will not live as long as my siblings because they already have manifestations of chronic disease. And in northeast Nebraska, where I'm from, we're in about the top 15 percentile in the country for underage alcohol use. Very personal to me when you speak of access to care. I come with an agenda. My son-in-law, who's an Army captain, used to help me with my slides. And after the objectives one day, he said to me, well, ma'am, and he calls me ma'am, which I think is hilarious because we don't talk like that in Nebraska. He's a native of Alabama. He said, what's your agenda? And I said, what do you mean my agenda? He said, what do you really want to talk about? So now whenever I come to a group, I always have something I really want to talk about. And this is it. You have the big wheels here. You have the basics of a wonderful campaign, but unless you fill in the little wheels, and that's all of you all have a role to play in a campaign for full practice authority. And I don't know how you say it in Oklahoma, but in Nebraska, we say it's butts out of the seat. You can't just sit there. You've got to get up and do something. And so I'm going to take you to my first lesson because I want to emphasize no experience required, and I want to explain to you how I got into this. In 2009, I was called to testify before the legislature, and I'll show you that trajectory in a minute. And I don't even remember why they asked me to speak. It happens that my very good friend down the street is a lobbyist, and I said, Natalie, I said, will you help me? And she did. She helped me with the testimony, and she stood in on that hearing, and that was one of those earlier drives for full practice authority at the time. But afterwards, and I've since then learned to read lobbyists, she was standing against the back wall, her arms crossed after it was over, and she said 2 things to me. The first one was she said, you have to have the right person, the right senator. Now, I didn't know it at the time. I do now, because that hearing, relative to what we later accomplished, was like a Saturday Night Live parody. But saying that was the equivalent of us saying, why'd you pick him to do your surgery? She also said, it's going to take a really long time. So understand that you already have a significant first plug, as I'm hearing you talk today, behind you. You're going to get it, and you're getting closer every time. So be patient and hold on. A little bit of background in terms of how things work in Nebraska, your neighbor to the north here. Our legislative districts, of which we have 49, as you can see, is moving westward into the Panhandle and the Sand Hills, the districts become larger and larger. The insets are Lincoln and Omaha. When we began our Full Practice Authority initiative, the advice to us is that we needed to go rural, that if we were going to win, we had to go rural. And when you say rural in Nebraska, that means just about everything outside of Lincoln and Omaha. We have 49 senators. We are a unicameral. We're the only unicameral in the nation. Our senators are elected on a nonpartisan basis, and we have a committee structure. So that means that every bill is first heard in committee. So I, as an individual, or Nebraska nurse practitioners as a group, can testify. And the intent is that every bill is heard and the citizens have a chance to testify. At the time of our credentialing review, prior to our bill, we had about 2/3 of our counties, and this hasn't changed much, are shortage areas. They have federal designations for shortage areas for primary care services, and about 94% had shortages for behavioral mental health services. Behavioral mental health was about 50% of our ask. It weighed in huge in our state. It gets a lot of attention. The trajectory of our legislation, and just a quick recap, in 1984 we practiced under the language of specific medical functions. The integrated practice agreement with physicians came about 10 years later, and we had 2 failed bills in initiatives in 2008 and 2009. So here's where it takes a long time part. The piece, the inset there that you see that says piecing, and I call that piecing after my Czech grandmother. Before overeating was as popular as it is today, Grandma used to call it piecing when you eat a little bit all day long. But prior to full practice authority, we had several small bills. And I'm going to borrow, and very successful initiatives, small ask, relatively easy, but I'm going to borrow an analogy from those of us that are in diabetes practice that we understand as a result of significant landmark studies at DCCT and UKPDS, and that's something that's called when you. I'm struggling. It'll come to me in a minute. But at the point that you introduce effective treatment early on, what happens is legacy effect. That's what I'm looking for. Legacy effect is you create this very positive aura and feeling. And so nurse practitioners have been very successful in these small bills. We had a respiratory, nurse practitioners allowed to sign respiratory therapy orders, death certificates, and we added the word acute to our scope of practice. In 2012, when I came about and chaired the credentialing review, and I'll explain that in a minute, that preceded 2 bills. The first, which was voted in the final reading of 4603, was ultimately pocket vetoed on the last day of the legislature. A huge disappointment, but probably the best thing that happened to us. And I'll talk about that later. And then finally, our successful bill in 2015. The credentialing review in Nebraska is an executive review process, must precede every scope of practice legislative bill. And you go in either as an unlicensed group or seeking a change in scope of practice. And so we argued that we were not seeking a change, but certainly there would be a significant change in our practice. The application, in our case, it was 150 pages. We were filed as the applicant group, is based on evidence. There's 3 phases. You have to pass through 3 separate steps of hearings. The first is the technical review committee. That's about 6 hearings. It's based on criteria that are very poorly worded, and I now work within Health and Human Services for the Board of Nursing, and so I'm very closely involved with the technical review hearings, but have a much fonder appreciation for how that language evolved. The second, we had to appear before the Board of Health, and finally, our Chief Medical Officer. Now, in the first 2 phases, we were handed ancillary recommendations by the bodies hearing us, and that was for the transition to practice agreement. The transition to practice, of which there is no evidence, was ultimately a negotiating point for us. It was something we carried in our back pocket, but these groups had recommended that we look at that. And in Nebraska, the initial 2,000 hours for new grads must be with a supervising physician or other nurse practitioner. The Chief Medical Officer, and you'll see there on the list of things he recommended for us, nothing that new. However, he did say that we should try to make the current practice agreement work, and that was probably the equivalent of a stall technique, a tactic on his part, as was above that the Board of Health said additional competency evaluations was probably a stall tactic, that recommendation. The basis of that, or I want you to think practically about that. So for those of us that are in specialty practice, to establish a competency evaluation that would, a one-size-fits-all would have been nearly impossible. That's a stall. So first lesson, number 1, clearly articulate the proposal. And here's a sample of an application question. Describe in detail the functions typically performed by nurse practitioners in the occupation. And so we answered it. So first, be very clear in your ask in the statutory context. We were asking for removal of the integrated practice agreement. Use key descriptors, valid authorities. We used AANP's definition of the process of care. Define important definitions, constructs, and in our case, physician supervision, autonomous practice, which we were still on the heels of the definition for plenary authority at that time. And now we call it full practice authority. And do not say independent practice. The walls of the silos go up immediately. It's full practice authority. And then finally, fundamental tenets. And essentially, we were not seeking a change in our scope of practice in Nebraska. And we have statutory provisions for consultation, collaboration, and referral. We also were seeking to improve access to care. And I want to show you how that plays out. This is Senator Crawford, is our sponsoring senator. She's a political science professor in Omaha. We did not write this for her. She became a student of our process. And let me go forward, I'm one ahead. I can't see this screen well, so if you see me struggling, this one's perfect. Mine is not so hot, so I'm showing my age here. Please allow me to set the record straight. LB 107 is not about a nurse practitioner's scope of practice, who has more clinical hours, or pretending to be physicians. The Integrated Practice Agreement, or IPA as we call it, limits competition and access to care. And as I said, we didn't write that for her. So very, very important to articulate your message. And I want to back up here to scope of practice. Be very clear when you're speaking to your legislators and stakeholders what scope of practice means, the boundaries within which you practice, and it assures your client of the safety of that practice. Lesson 2, see with the historic optic. In preparing the application, very necessarily, I went back and looked in the old transcripts. And there were some very surprising revelations. First, definition of supervision was never intended to mean that a physician was probably somewhere else in the state. However, ready availability was not defined. We learned during the course of our credentialing review that we had at least one nurse practitioner in the state who had moved out. Her collaborating physician was from a Middle Eastern country, frequently traveled home, and her ready availability were calls on her dime to his native country when she had a question. Implied physician liability. This was an incredible paradigm surprise for me. And early in the debates, the senators associated, and again, it's so important to speak to your legislators, it became clear in reading the transcripts that they believed that if the physicians supervised nurse practitioners, that implied liability for their activities, and yes, it does. We had commissioned a case law review from Carolyn Bubert that established that 50% of the time physicians are found liable in cases that go to court. However, the paradigm was that liability implied a higher standard of care for patients. And I want you to think about that. And then finally, no evidence, and this was the most surprising to me. This was the reason I went back to the old transcripts. I wanted to know what evidence they used. None, zero, nada. So not that long ago, we didn't have as much evidence as we now. We have 40 years of outcome studies. And here's how the testimony looks. Linda LeJour, I'm embarrassed to tell you, came to us. Linda is somewhat of an icon in the state and had been president of Nebraska Nurses Association at the time that the Integrated Practice Agreement was legislated. And what she explained was that the Integrated Practice Agreement was political compromise. And what was on the table at the time, we're the only state in the union, aside from the unicameral, we also have an APRN board. We were under the thumb of the medical board, and that was the negotiating piece. That was what was on the table. We would have still been under the medical board had we not agreed to that practice agreement, but there was no evidence for that. Linda also testified for us because she was a member of the Board of Health at the time that the regulations were written, and she testified how the regulatory process had really failed us in the implementation. For example, the definition of supervision. It was written as ready availability, but wasn't actualized that way. Lesson 3, qualify and quantify. Integrated practice agreements are hard to obtain and maintain. Collaborating physicians do die. They do drop practice agreements. I've been in that situation myself 3 or 4 times. The waiver option, which we have in Nebraska, did not work. Nurse practitioners who were granted a waiver by the APRN board would get 6 to 12 months, and then they would have to reapply if it was granted at all. We could only count on one hand the time waivers had been granted to those nurses that couldn't find a collaborating physician. Now, if you're a practice owner, starting up and opening your doors for 6 to 12 months is not a very appealing proposition. We lose nurse practitioners to other states. The exodus across our borders is into Colorado, Wyoming, and Iowa. Those are the full practice authority states around us, and we had evidence that that was happening. And finally, physician fees. I don't know what your experience is here, but our nurse practitioners were paying exorbitant fees to maintain these agreements. And we used very, very politically correct language when we talked about there was no oversight in exchange for those fees. No measurable return to consumers, and you'll notice I have dollar signs with a comma there implying 3 zeros behind the lead numbers. And then very politely questionable motives. If you've never seen the patient and you're collecting a check, what is your motivation? And here's the testimony where this paid off in spades for us. This is Senator Kathy Crawford. She is chair of Health and Human Services Committee at the time. And I want to paint the picture. She's a stout, matronly woman, and she was looking over the top of her glasses at the lobbyist for our opponent at the time. She said this: "You know, the issue before the committee is exactly what we're talking about 4 years ago." So she's talking about the 2009 hearing that I had participated in. The nurse practitioner, another one who had testified there, was paying $10,000 at the time for her practice agreement. Within days of her testimony, her practice agreement was pulled for no apparent reason. The senators knew that, but no one could prove what the reason for that was. But here's the kicker. So she's pointing this out, but she also said, we didn't get perhaps a suggestion from you, and we were now post-credentialing review, which we had successfully completed. We didn't get from your group, i.e. you, the opposition, at least a suggestion as to how you can come together. Because the expectation with the credentialing review is that we would have reached some common ground. Here's testimony. It's an exchange in the same committee hearing that occurred a few minutes before that. And the X's there, in Nebraska, the initials would be NMA. Here, it's probably OMA. And I want to give you a picture of this particular senator. Would be like Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. Ponytail, looks like she's about 12. She has a sweet, soft voice. And when she's an attorney, and she's very, very, very bright young woman, but when she speaks, she'll say something like, And she said, so, can you ever remember a time when you've been a proponent of change in scope? And if you do, how have you worked with that other group? And as one of my colleagues said later, that was the equivalent of going for the jugular. It was very effective. Now I want to tell you, and neither of these are very complimentary examples for our opponents, and in hindsight, and this only occurred to me just recently, what had happened, and this was very early in our trajectory, so this was before that bill that ultimately was pocket vetoed, But here's what happened. And I apologize, I'm from Nebraska, for those of you that are football fans. However, this put us in the offensive position very, very early in our process. Being in the offensive position was echoed, and I sent a link to a webinar that I was able to do for the Campaign for Authority in July, and spoke with a colleague from Minnesota and Nevada. But in Minnesota, the speaker emphasized the same thing, and I hope you put that link on your website to listen to her. But she emphasized being in the offense position. You never want to be defending yourself. You want to be leading the charge. So remember that. Very important. Lesson 4. Tell constituent stories to illustrate the problems. And this is where many, many folks can get involved. It's very difficult to do. I firmly believe that Nebraska does not have the market on amazing nurse practitioner stories. And you need to start collecting these now and making yourself known. It's very difficult to get folks to come forward and tell their story, however, because this may be normal. This is Merlene. Lives in the Sandhills. She's a rancher's wife. She's a new NP graduate, has about 15 years psych mental health experience, is unable to get a practice agreement at the time. Her story went all the way to the New York Times for us, and on the day that LB 107, so ultimately our successful bill passed, she was pulling a calf. Everybody knows what that is. She's a bona fide rancher's wife. And she articulates very well, here you can read, what it is and how much her community and practicing there means to her. This is Ginger Brasul, who I call Mother Teresa, now Saint Teresa. I had a chance to meet Ginger. And she ministers to the homeless in her Panhandle community. Scottsbluff is about 8 hours from Omaha and Lincoln. And the APRN board asked her to find a psychiatrist in Omaha or Lincoln for her practice agreement. Most of our psychiatrists in the state have agreements with their employers, and so they cannot enter into agreements outside of their employers. Hence, it's very difficult to find a psychiatrist in the state. So she pays for the Nebraska licensure. At that time, was paying for the Nebraska licensure of a Colorado psychiatrist, which for her was an easy couple-hour drive, and somebody she worked with very well. About 25% of her caseload is pro bono, and she made rounds in the KOA campgrounds and really wanted to take care of these folks in her community. Truly amazing individual. This is, and I stuck this one in for this agreement, education is starting to factor the natural links that we can make with the Board of Education and educators in our state, because we're all interested in students. This particular individual is a nurse practitioner in student health at University of Nebraska, Kearney, and what piqued the senator's interest in her testimony, and I'll just mention this, is there's a tremendous amount of pride in state-funded schools. And they were a little dismayed that her school had asked her to acquire dual certification in primary care and behavioral health, but in terms of acquiring a practice agreement, they were of no help to her. And here is, this is Janelle Grant from out in the Panhandle. Let me tell you a little bit about her hometown of Alliance, Nebraska. She's the only pediatric practitioner within a 50 to 60 mile radius in her community. In the Panhandle, in the summer months, if you want to canoe down the Niobrara, it's beautiful. It's a very remote setting, beautiful, iconic scenery. However, if you get stuck in those places in the winter during a blizzard, you will die. It's a very remote location. In a letter to her senator, she gave a typical example of what her practice was like. She was caring for a 2-week-old infant with allergic colitis. Ranch family lived 80 miles from her office. She was mailing the prescriptions and making daily phone calls. She had moved to Alliance. She followed her husband, who's a high school coach, but she'd worked with a pediatric group in Scotts Bluff on the edge of the state, had very good connections in Denver and Colorado Springs, I believe, where when she had a really sick child, it's a 4-hour ambulance ride or about 2.5-hour life flight. But what she was able to articulate very clearly was how she maintained her competency in her practice and also her connections. And then finally, my last example, and this is economic development. This particular nurse practitioner was courted to come to her central Nebraska community from Kansas. The townspeople there helped her secure a small business loan, find space for business. They'd lost their physician in that community. After she opened her office, 5 new businesses came to town. I don't think senators aren't interested in that as evidence of economic development. Lesson 5, evidence is not difficult to amass, translation is paramount. The distortions, and these are common, you'll hear these from our opponents. Education, malpractice liability was a huge one. It started not just in the old transcripts, but was an ongoing issue and persists today. Currently, and one of the things that I was telling Tony earlier is that you think you reach full practice authority and you're done. Well, the newest generation of issues for us is we have physicians in some of our critical access hospitals that are insisting on collaborative agreement with nurse practitioners, arguing that we're not insurable, which is not true. Team-based care, most often the Holy Grail is held as the Virginia model. And we all, as nurses, we all know about team-based care. And we also know that the leader does not necessarily have to be a physician. Clinical acumen, it took us a while to catch on. Every time an example was cited of less than stellar practice, they were usually talking about PAs in their offices. Arguments were made regarding unnecessary referral, that this will drive up our healthcare costs, and there's simply no evidence for that. And then finally, a huge negotiating point for us in the state was workforce data. And I didn't think it was possible, but we heard some distortions. In one particular hearing, state maps were produced that I hadn't seen before, and so I went back to the Office of Rural Health and I said, Tom, where'd they get those maps? And he laughed, and Tom works for Health and Human Services, and he said, I'm so sorry, Kathy. He said, they asked for it, I had to give it to them. I'm a public servant, but what our opponents had asked for was a rendition of the data in a specific format, which distorted it. Resources, and none of these are new, and I'm certainly not going to walk through this laundry list. The thing I want to emphasize is on the very bottom of the page is what's new is workforce data. And Nevada and Minnesota, who I had an opportunity to co-present with in July, are certainly leaders in terms of accumulating workforce data. I hope as Nebraska will be next in line. When I go back home on Friday, we're meeting with the consultant, our Center for Nursing, to look at ways to collect data that reflect that we are indeed getting nurse practitioners to underserved groups. I'll also tell you in terms of data that was very difficult to get. Surveying membership was a tough one. We usually had about a 5% response rate if we needed an answer from our members and needed it quick. So no assumptions. Senator Crist, as you see here, is a pilot. And in this particular, the testifier before him is a nurse practitioner who owned a home health agency, and she was trying to explain to him the difficulties incurred. And essentially what she was explaining is that they met with a physician on a weekly basis to get about 300 signatures. That's all they needed from him, and we're paying him a fee to retain him to do that. But finally, and she's kind of going roundabout, and finally he said, and he was doing us a favor because he wanted this to appear in the transcripts. You've got to put it in simple terms. You're forced to pay a physician for that signature, and he never sees the patients. And the answer, of course, was yes. So say it in plain language. Translation: discuss clinical research data in ordinary language. And this is where you need your educators. You don't want people like me standing up and trying to explain research 101. In that list, what's most important is make sure that you're explaining the hierarchy of how we acquire knowledge. So small studies beget larger studies, and that takes us to the systemic reviews and the meta-analysis and finally Cochrane review. What happened to us is our opponents in a hearing threw a pile of small, unrelated studies on the desk and said, these aren't adequately powered, and what kind of evidence is this? Well, of course, I mean, we all knew that as nurses and having had research, we understood that. But if you've got a lay consumer or lawmaker on the other side, they may not understand that when we talk about outcome data, of which we have acquired 40 to 50 years, we're not talking about small, unrelated studies. These are large and statistically validated studies. Back up anything that you present in writing with spoken, and spoken with writing. Now, what do I mean about that? Don't assume that anything you hand in the course of your campaign in writing will necessarily be read. As is anything, and anytime you meet with someone and speak to them, don't assume that they'll remember everything that you said. Always send a note afterwards. Reiterate. Same is true if you testify. Reiterate your key points one more time. And always thank them for your senators, your legislators for their service and for the time they gave you. Lesson 6, make issues non-issues. So here's an example of, and I'll give you 3 committee questions. This is during the course of the credentialing review, and these were things that our opponents were very, very anxious and actually delighted that these kinds of things came out, because these are distortions that they're happy to see. Online courses, that's nurse practitioner education. Second question, how much clinical time, and these are written as they said them, does a typical nurse practitioner student receive? And as you know, our opponents are eager to say that we don't get nearly as much clinical time as they do. And then finally, what's the comparison between curriculum? We really, for the most part, during the credentialing review, failed miserably in our education testimony. And when we finally got it right is when we stopped making the apples to apples comparison. How we're educated as nurses is not medical education, it's different. However, our outcomes are at least the equivalent. And here's an example of testimony. This is my good friend and colleague, Julie Sundermeyer, who is one of our credentialing review committee members. And here you can see that she talks about the comparison of education models side by side is not the appropriate measure of success or safety. Evidence-based medicine is the gold standard. And then here she goes on to say health policy and regulation should follow these same standards. So remember, don't use apple to, this is an apple to orange deal, and you need to, when you're asked questions about nursing education, explain it as it is, not as a comparison. The following table represents a significant turning point for us. This is before the Board of Health hearing. This was worth 2 committee votes for us in that particular hearing. And it was something we missed during the course of the credentialing review. However, our APRN rep on the Nebraska Board of Nursing brought this to our attention and rose and stood and spoke extemporaneously at one point to explain. And even the physician reviewers on that committee did not know that physicians in our state to renew their license only needed CE. And their CE are the equivalent of ours. Nurse practitioners, that 40-10 represents 40 hours of general ed and at least 10 hours of pharmacotherapeutics. But it was a tremendous rallying point and worth 2 votes for us. Professional conduct matters. What others hear and observe is more important than what you say. And I want to give you a couple anecdotes to illustrate how effectively we use behaviorists in our midst. The hearing rooms during the credentialing review were long and narrow, and so we were forced as a panel to sit at these long and narrow tables. We have an opponent in the state who's been coming to every hearing for full practice authority since the beginning of time. He's easily agitated, very vocal, and in recent years has now become hard of hearing. So I just want to paint the picture for you. And here he plops down in the middle of our group of nurses. So we needed to be able to lean over to each other and talk, and he's sitting there. Right next to him sits my good friend, Kathy Phillips. And on a break, I hear Kathy, who's seated at eye level to him, hands in her lap. I hear her say, "I am surprised to hear you say that." And I thought, I wonder what she's talking to him about. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about Kathy. Her specialty is geropsych. She's a well-known lecturer in the state on communication techniques, dementia, and cognitive impairment in the agitated elder. What better person to create some air of civility in that environment. So use the behaviorists among you. The second I have there, designated attendees to take notes. Very, very important. Anytime you have a group go in a hearing or however your legislative system is set up, have somebody there employed purely to take notes and pay attention to the cues. Now, I'll give you an example of, and I had a very good friend that was unable to attend this particular hearing, and she called me and she said, "Kathy, how did it go?" I said, "Terrible. It was terrible. This is one of the worst days of my life, terrible." And she said, "Well, what happened?" And I said, "Well, so-and-so, we were trying to get, our rooms were not AV friendly, and we were having difficulty connecting a nurse practitioner who, instead of driving 8 hours, agreed to speak to our group remotely. And we couldn't make the connection, and one of our opponents got tired of it, stood up, threw some stuff, and said, "This is a waste of my time." And he stood in the middle of the room. And I said, "It was terrible." I said, "Our technical review committee froze. The hearing from that point forward was a waste of everybody's time." She said, "Oh." She said, "He was employing power tactics. You know that, don't you?" Now, had I recognized at the time, a natural response would have been what? Would have maybe been standing up, disrupting a group, was a deliberate and probably a learned response on his part, but could have easily circumvented that perhaps with, "Madam Chair, excuse me, we have the floor," or "Excuse me, we're speaking now," or just a simple courtesy. So again, have somebody take notes and pay attention to the dynamics in the room. We always confronted privately during our technical review, the hearing process. Anything that's submitted to the committee becomes evidence and is posted on the Health and Human Services website. And our opponents sent one of the quote pieces of evidence was a letter, and it was written. Didn't name names, but Nebraska is a small enough state that it didn't take much to figure out who he was talking about an alleged incompetent performance. Now, at no point is anything that has to do with full practice authority, derived campaign legislation, technical review committee hearing, whatever it is, should never be about individuals and any sort of allegations directed towards practice. And so I asked for a redact of that letter, and we knew who the nurse practitioner was, and we assured her that we would try what we could. Her brother's an attorney in the state as well, and we recognized that it could get very uncomfortable for everybody. And I was denied the redact. However, I had done that privately, and any time we had something like that, we approached our committee chair privately, and I do believe it gained points for us. We simply would not fight with our opponents within view of the committee. Always grace under fire. Our committee chair was blind. I believe that became an asset for us because we were forced to be polite. We had to interrupt her. Sometimes she had someone seated by her that would point out cues in the room, but sometimes not. We had to interrupt, but we always had to be very polite. And Angie Golden, our past president of AANP, tells a related story about that. And her experience, her experience was in the days following. Everybody remembered The View, the controversy with I believe it was the candidate from Colorado. Do you remember that particular? she was interviewed and asked to speak, and the cameraman that day was limping. And she said very reflexively, she questioned him. She said, well, you know, what's with your knee? Have you done anything about that? Have you? And her point was, and that particular cameraman granted her more interview time that day, but she said her point was not that you're looking for favors, but as nurses, we're always on duty. We're always attending to the others in our environment. No cheering or clapping. Only once, it only happened once during one of our hearings, and I did the mad mama cow thing. Do you all know what that is? Head down, eyes up, don't mess with the calf look. You know what I'm talking about? Absolutely never. Avoid being baited in any of your hearings or discussions, of which there will be plenty of opportunities. In our case, one of our one of our credential review committee members had a calculator out, and our opponent was explaining to the group, at least in his eyes, making a comparison of the number of clinical hours. And I could see Sandra there with her calculator doing the math. What I didn't know is that she was going to stand and rise and begin to challenge him. And then pretty soon it became like an exchange between two angry cats. It was ugly. So our lobbyist is sitting behind me, and I hear her hiss, "Tell her to stop." So I lean over, and next to me is our NNP president. I said, "Cora says tell her to stop." She said, "I did." I said, "Tell her I said to stop." She leans over and says, "Kathy says stop." She stopped mid-sentence, but again, do not engage. And then finally, avoid unflattering risks and defamation. We certainly weren't extended that courtesy, but we never returned. Now, in part, that's because nurses were as scared as rabbits, but we never, ever engaged in any sort of defamatory remarks about our colleagues, our physician colleagues. Lesson 8, educate and disseminate. Ideal, and David did a nice job of explaining to you how important it is to get out and meet with your candidates and eventually your legislators. In Nebraska, we were successful, and we only have 49, mind you. It's very difficult, but about 60% of our legislators, we were able to find a nurse practitioner that would agree to speak to them on a one-on-one basis. Very difficult to do. So ideal is that you assign someone. And the analogy I'll give you is in planting that, think of it as a garden. So if you plant the garden and you close the gate, and you never go back to pull the weeds or stake the tomatoes or do any of the other things, you just can't assume that because you've assigned someone that it's going to happen. And not because they're unwilling, but because they need talking points, they need encouragement, they need ideas. So I would encourage you to find a way to engage with nurse practitioners that are willing to work one-on-one and legislators, and then nurture those relationships. We were booth sponsors of both Nebraska Nurse Practitioners, the Nebraska Hospital Association Fall Conferences, just to get our face in places. The Hospital Association netted a big find for us. I was there manning the booth. I was next to the concession table, and if you want to know how ungratifying it is when everybody walks by you because they're far more interested in the food than they are you. But I hear a voice behind me, and she said, "Kathy, what are you doing here?" And it was a football mom. Anybody here a football mom? And you've spent hours on the benches with other moms. And I said, and I explained to her why I was there and what I was doing, and she said, "Let me introduce you to my boss." Well, guess what? He was the contact at the Hospital Association that we needed. Yay! Now, first year, we got a neutral. Hospital Association weighed in neutral on our bill, but ultimately for 107, our successful bill, they came in and supported us. So those contacts, you start in simple ways. Our Nebraska Nurse Practitioner Association president did forums, met with groups of nurse practitioners around the state. Another big win for us, she netted Marilyn, What I know about Marilyn is that she's a Harley rider, and she demonstrates at one of our conferences as the Harley Wave. I've never seen that before. But Marilyn was a close friend of Senator Watermeyer in the state, who ultimately agreed to introduce our first bill as priority legislation, which is a designation we needed. Again, a relationship there. And then finally, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Nebraska Nurse Association. All legislation in the state prior to for nurse practitioners prior to 2010 had always been introduced through the Nebraska Nurse Association. So our NNA is politically vibrant and engaged. And so they, in addition to a legislative day, which I heard you talk about here, they have an engagement forum for candidates. Ours was in August on election years. And then they also, there's a reception to meet the candidates. And 2 years ago, we had a new governor candidate. So keep in mind that in 2014, our governor had pocket vetoed our proposal, and now we had 2 new candidates for governor. And so I had been introduced to now First Lady Suzanne Shore, who is a nurse. And I also happened to know that now Governor Ricketts' aunt was Sister Veronica at our Pius High School in Lincoln and had taught all of my children. So we're chatting about the school system and about nursing in general. And she introduced me to her husband. And I said, and I again told him who I was and what my interest was. And I said, so will you sign our bill? And he said, yeah, I'll sign it. And the lobbyist from the Nurse Association was within earshot. He said, we've been trying for years to get that. He said, and you just asked, how did that happen? And he did sign it. So here's my do and don't list in terms of engaging others. I want to make a good point for talking points, elevator speeches. I want to tell you about my own experience with our District 28 candidate in Lincoln. It was a fall afternoon like this 2 years ago, and my husband and I are both farm kids from northeast Nebraska. He hunts, and he'd been out hunting turkey. And he came home and he said, Kathy, I want you to help me dress this bird, which I'd rather do anything than that. And so my husband's 6'5", and he's got a knife this long, and I'm pretty sure he doesn't know what he's doing. And there's no way for me to get out of helping him with the bird, which I'm holding by the legs, and he's dressing without wearing some of it and smelling like it. So and what do you wear to dress a turkey? It's the oldest thing you have. So I'm like this, I'm like, oh. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna go for a quick walk in the neighborhood, and then I'm gonna come in and shower. So I'm out power walking, and I'm a diabetes educator. I practice what I preach, and I didn't see her. It was our District 28 candidate. And she was going house to house that day, and we live in an old tree-lined neighborhood, and she was just almost on top of me, and I'm standing there eyeball to eyeball with her, and she's wearing Anne Klein, and I'm not. And so I put out my hand to greet her, and there's blood on the sleeve. So conversation starter right there, because I was pretty sure she knew nothing. She's an attorney about hunting turkeys. Or dressing them in the backyard. So then she asked me my name, and she said, oh, Gary, I know your husband. And I thought, oh, great. Because if you know my husband, you know that that is not your yard sign that is up on our front lawn. And so could this get any worse? So she then proceeds to ask me, what she was asking everybody, I'm sure, that day as she's knocking on doors. She said, so what do you think is the most important issue facing voters this year? Well, 2 years into the credentialing review, let me tell you, I knew exactly what to tell her. And she whips out a notebook and starts taking notes. I thought, oh, I'm never going to get out of here. But we left it. Of course, she asked for my card, like, yeah, right. I have that on me. But she gave me hers, and I emailed her. We had a one-pager, and I think I sent her a copy of the National Government Association report. She did. She sponsored LB 107 that year. She was a co-sponsor. She remembers me when I see her. And she was, in fact, on Sunday afternoon, knocked on my door. She's bringing around somebody from that's running for the school board in the city this election. And let me tell you, wouldn't be my choice for a way to get acquainted with someone, but however, when I approach her and talk to her, she knows who I am. And I said, listen, I'm working for the Board of Nursing now. In January, come January, that's when our session convenes, I'm going to walk across the plaza and I'll come and chat with you and tell you what nursing is up to. So again, humble beginnings, but have your talking points with you. Open the door to your nursing colleagues. This is an issue for all of nursing, so engage your educators, other organizations. Stakeholders. In Nebraska, we have an expression that if you can't find something to connect or some way that you know someone, you just haven't been talking to them long enough. And with stakeholders, during the course of our credentialing review, I always provided them with periodic updates. It was a year-long process. So I always let them know periodically would send a note, here's where we're at, and here's how your support, how this has helped us get to this point. So this is not a greet 'em and drop 'em kind of thing, but maintain ongoing relationships. We were a guest at the monthly Nebraska Action Coalition meetings, which is the group of the Campaign for Action, and that's and I hope your legislative committee and your board knows about the monthly learning collaborative calls. Very helpful, and your leadership can participate in those. I want to emphasize member-only access to your website, and it sounds to me just in listening that your league's ahead of us in Nebraska in terms of what your website can do for you. And I won't name names, but we did happen to get somebody else's talking points because they weren't very well secured electronically in their newsletter. Distinguish lobbyist-only context, those critical votes. For us, that was the Hospital Association. At the point that the introduction had been made, and I got the business card of that person of the Hospital Association, I turned it over to the lobbyist. Periodically stopped for formal celebrations and recognitions. You always want to acknowledge the folks that are supporting you. And thank you notes, I've already said this, always acknowledge. Anytime you've had a chance to speak to someone, meet them, testify before a group, always send a thank you note. Thank them for their service, reiterate your talking points, and then provide immediate feedback when you can. Emails to senators are very effective, particularly during the end of the session when they're doing the equivalent of what football players call 2-a-days or 3-a-days. There's long sessions. And I had, on one particular occasion, after some very effective testimony, about 11 o'clock at night, I thought, I don't want to handwrite a note, I'm just going to drop an email. And I had an immediate response from the senator, and you could tell he was tired, and he said, thank you. He said, it's been a long day, and I appreciate your words, so remember that. On the limit, caution, avoid list, don't wait until you want something to talk to your legislators. Now during election season is good, but ideally you've been talking to them already. Our lobbyist advises meeting with legislators at least once a year for coffee or the equivalent of. Remember, in smaller communities, it's not uncommon for you to be sharing church pews or seeing those folks in coffee shops or other places in your community. Consumer letters, and I mentioned those were a real mixed bag for us. And the reason is no quality control. We asked for consumer letters at one point, and what we got, despite the fact that we had submitted, we'd sent out a template and here's how they should appear, we got a lot of handwritten notes on yellow lined paper and shaky handwriting. Also had a letter from a patient who had met the love of his life, the nurse practitioner who had removed his toenail, and he wrote in great detail. And of course it was a very heartfelt message, but it was not one that we could use. We employed a distinctly different tactic in Nebraska. Our lobbyist does not believe in mass emailing and form letters. Now, as I say that to you, there's some states that have used that very effectively. Our colleague in Minnesota on the webinar talks about how nurses in Minnesota clogged up the phone lines when it looked like their bill was going to be delayed in committee. And they had to call them and say, tell the nurses to stop calling in. It worked very well. That bill ultimately made it out of committee, as I recall, as she's telling the story. But for us in Nebraska, we used very pointed, deliberate contacts before key votes. Our lobbyists said that senators are annoyed by nothing more than 300 emails of the same rote message. Also want to tell you, we learned from our opponents how telephone and text messaging can backfire. You need to know who the audience is. Before the committee vote, the final vote, the 4603 on the final reading of our first bill that moved it, or that prior to the veto occurred, the debate that particular evening, there was a very bitter battle in Nebraska between optometrists and ophthalmologists. And the tactic that had been employed, and I wouldn't have known about this, however, we had received one of these robocalls at the house, and one of my adult daughters had picked up the phone, and she hung up and she said, "Mom," she said, "what are they talking about? Cutting into grandma's eyeballs? What is?" Well, and I knew what it was about because I was aware of what was happening in the legislature between the optometrists and ophthalmologists. Well, however, the debate that immediately preceded our vote, so this record 4603 vote, which is for all intents and purposes is unanimous, the senators debated the optometrist-ophthalmologist bill, and they were livid, absolutely livid. Not in our state. We are not going to allow that kind of messaging to our seniors and frightening them. I really, in retrospect, I don't think that hurt us. So it was our opponents had dug their own hole in that aspect, but it probably worked in our favor, the whole timing of that particular debate. Following LB 107, and this is at the point that the bill passed and signed into law, text messages starting appearing on Omaha phones, so as a particular cell phone provider, but it was the equivalent of the AMA's "Do you know who your doctor is?" that infogram. And folks were livid. It was perceived as sour grapes and totally inappropriate. So again, in this era of push-the-button technology, you still want to know who the messaging is going to. Lesson 9, talk and keep talking to your stakeholders. And I have a list here of folks that we engaged very early in the process of the credentialing review. And I'll let you read through that list. I'm going to show you some testimony as a consequent to that. And this is the CRNAs, and I understand that the CRNAs here in this state do not have full practice authority. That's correct? Am I correct? In Nebraska, our CRNAs have practiced that way since the 80s, a long time. They are in 99% of our operating rooms. They have a marvelous safety record. And in Sean's testimony, he articulated very well, and you can see in the last line there, he talks about Nebraska being an attractive venue for them to move, to locate their families and to live in their communities. And again, along with the lines of economic development, this is very attractive testimony to legislators. The stakeholders, following just a quick note, during the hearing for Health and Human Services hearing for 916, some of the best testimony was other than nurses, and that was the statistician from the University of Nebraska Medical Center, College of Public Health, the workforce data. Senators received that particular individual very well. Following the veto of 916, this is one of the smartest things we did, is that, and we were hounded by the media. They really wanted the dirt. And our lobbyists implored us and made it very, very clear that the only thing we could say, if anyone that was called, was that we are disappointed. That's it. That's all we'd say. Because we knew we had to go back before the legislature the following year, and we weren't going to be caught with any sort of words that we would regret. Well, in the meantime, an op-ed came out in the Lincoln Journal-Star that was written, not coincidentally, by the husband of one of our our Credentialing Review Committee members, but an op-ed, and it was not us speaking. And I'll show you that in a minute. But also, the other thing about the time gap between 916, which was vetoed, and 107, we had 17 new senators coming in, and we had one who, 17 that were term limited, and then one who was an incumbent who was ousted. So we had a lot of education to do. And this is where I want to emphasize that calamity can truly become an opportunity. So the second time out of the chute, we were much better at meeting with senators and educating them. And the other thing that had happened is a great number of folks in the state were angered about that pocket veto. And we'll never know for sure, but it was probably politically motivated and a payback for someone else. But that move garnered more empathy for our position than had we won 916 unfettered. At the point that we got to the hearing for 107, there was no one in the state against us, absolutely no one. So here is, this is the op-ed. This was written by the economist and the accounting professors from University of Nebraska, Kearney. This was at the time of the veto. Very important because it wasn't nurses speaking. Here's some key testimony from the school system. Again, I want to emphasize this was surprise testimony from us. We didn't know that they were coming. I just heard from a colleague of mine in North Platte, Nebraska last week that she's been approached by the school system there to set up some sort of clinic, a new model there. I look for educators and nurses to join arms in the state. So I really want to explain that my idea is not, or my goal here is not to tell you what may work for you, but rather to make suggestions, or not to tell you what to do, but what may work. So don't overlook the educators. And this was a more surprise testimony. This was the Americans for Prosperity that testified on behalf. And Campaign for Action is telling me that AFP is figuring heavily in conservative states, of which we are. And finally, last lesson 10, relationships. This particular bit of testimony, this is a junior senator speaking. He did a marvelous job. After you read a lot of testimony, which I have, junior senators are still learning the ropes and the language. And this is just a synopsis of what he said, but he really captured pretty well our message in terms of scope of practice, what we did, improving access to care. And it turned out, when he speaks of her in this example, he's talking about his sister-in-law in the state who's a nurse practitioner. I had the opportunity to meet her about a year later. I saw the name on a name tag at a conference like this and kind of scouted her down and sat with her at lunch and thanked her for educating him. And she looked at me and she shrugged her shoulders like, yeah. And she said, you know, he's a veterinarian, he's a self-directed learner. And it occurred to me that it wasn't so much deliberate as the fact that she'd probably just spoken to him like the rest of us speak to our brother-in-law at Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever family holiday. But again, how important that is. Barriers, quick word, are opponents. No surprises here. They're well-funded in funders. I talked about some of the power techniques that are employed. They're also masters of fear, doubt, and uncertainty. And I want to point out, if you haven't seen, there's a 5-minute spot that came out, Susan Apold and a physician named Yule Ines put together in response to the issue before the Veterans Association for Practice Authority for APRNs. But in this, Yule emphasizes that much of what we hear from our opponents is rhetoric. And please understand it's rhetoric. Life as we know it is changing. Those clinicians, and he emphasized, regardless of whether it's nursing or medicine, those of us that are on the ground and understand patient care, we understand that things have to change. And so recognize that what the opponents are bringing before us is really a result of that fear of change and what's happening in their world. In Nebraska, had we entered the Medicaid debate for Medicaid expansion, we would have been dead in the water. Our sponsoring Senator Watermeyer, who agreed to take our bill on, had we entered the Medicaid debate, he would have not sponsored that legislation for us. So be aware of other political traps, and that's what the lobbyist is there to help you navigate those. We also had a bill in Nebraska in 2015 that was a derivative of the AMA's Truth in Advertising bill. And essentially, the substance of the bill was that if you're advertising any sort of medical services, that you have to display your licensure credentials. It was kind of a kind of bill. And initially, when we looked at it, they came before us. First, we thought, okay, there's got to be some hidden agenda here, something. And our lobbyist said, you guys, leave it alone. You don't want to oppose this, look at it. There's no other intentions. And ultimately, we went with it. The message is that you need to pick your battles. And the last thing we needed in 2015 was to oppose the Medical Association in any way, because our intent was that we were portrayed as wanting to work with them and cooperate. So again, be aware of those kind of pitfalls. Conflicting member messaging. I want to emphasize that from our national associations, it's not uncommon for the emphasis to be placed on mass emailing and signing form letters. And remember, in our state association, we work very differently, and at times, emails would come back to back, one from our state association, one national, and they were telling members to do two different things. So just be aware that can happen. And then finally, subversive enemies. We had one in the state who was from in our own nursing ranks, who did a lot of damage for us. In Nebraska, we certainly have a full successful legislation. We have a law, but we still do not have nursing regulations written. And finally, strategic counsel or your lobbying team. Here's all the things that they can do for you. The biggest surprise for me here is not just the right senator. And you remember Natalie made that comment to me early on, but there's an order of the ask. So it's not just who you ask, but in what order, and who one recommends as his or her colleague to carry the bill. Now, our lobbyist would not allow me to put this slide up unless I put up the next one. And David did a very nice job of articulating this. The most powerful lobbyist isn't the person you hire, it's the constituent, it's all of you. At the point that you get to implementation, and what I'm hearing is that you're getting close here in Oklahoma, you're committed to the expenditure of time, incremental change. You've acquired a repository of data and information. For us, that was the credentialing review. So we had loads of files to draw upon when we were asked for a particular document. We had it. And boots on the ground, that's all of you. So you've mobilized your membership. Testimony, which is the expression of everything else that you're doing, is very necessarily cast and script, and not just the order of the testifiers, but that you have an experienced pool of testifiers, and you're using visuals and handouts. And as our lobbyist always tells us, less is more. So you don't need a lot of people testifying, but what they said should dovetail each other and articulate your points very clearly. You're able to anticipate questions and opposing arguments and ask the right questions. And remember Sarah Howard in asking, so what have you done to support any changes in scope of practice? And finally, summary. Here's the 10 points. I'm not going to walk through those again. And I want to leave you with 2 pictures. This is what I call home. My parting thought, I'm native of rural northeast Nebraska, is that never forget who you are, what you know, and where you came from and what you bring to the equation. And this is what it looks like when the governor signs the bill. That's it. Is it time for questions?
You've got questions.
Okay, questions. I think that means they're ready, Tony.
I have a question.
Sure.
How much did your nurse practitioner group work with other advanced practice nurses, such as midwives and?
You know, that's a great question. And as I mentioned, I'm now the practice consultant for the Board of Nursing, so my worldview has changed. We were approached after our legislation had passed. It was only nurse practitioners, and as the credentialing review is written in statute, I don't know that we could have had another group participate with that. But the midwives, so our CRNAs have full practice authority. Midwives are a very small group, maybe 150, maybe in the state. CNSs are less than that. And they said, why didn't you invite us along? They're a very small group, they don't have a lobbyist. And it wasn't until after we were done. Last month, I had mentioned I'd spoken to a group like this in Texas, and Texas, you guys, gosh, what wonderful neighbors to have. They're ready to roll out their initiative. They have all 4 groups of APRNs who've agreed to draft language for their bill. And I thought, oh, we should have done that because of Nursing Compact. And I'm just learning about Nursing Compact. We have it for registered nurses. Nebraska is a compact state. Board of Nursing will be introducing legislation in Nebraska so that we can be admitted to the new and improved compact. So naturally, what follows behind that is compact for advanced practice nurses. There's only 2 states right now in the compact. And I thought how very difficult it is going to be for us to enter advanced practice compact because we don't have uniform language or laws relating to midwives and CNSs in the state, and we're going to be hard-pressed to do that because they're small groups, they're not well organized, they don't have any lobbying power. So the long answer to your very short question is, I really regret that we didn't have that sort of insight into how important it would have been that we had lobbied for those groups. And again, I can see it's going to be very, very difficult to bring midwives and CNSs up in the state to full practice authority. And what I saw in Texas is they're doing it right. You know, they're agreeing on language in the front end. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yes?
Can I just ask you a personal question as far as in your practice? What got you sort of interested in being involved in politics and lobbying and all this stuff? Like, at what point did you go from a practicing nurse practitioner into being involved and interested in all of this?
You know, at the time, I was secretary for the association, and I'm naturally bookish. I like that kind of stuff. And we had been approached, you have to do this credentialing review, just get over it. You know, I had, within a month of that, so I was the secretary at that meeting taking the notes, and had been for 2 years at that point, so I knew a lot about the organization and had zero involvement prior to that, but had learned a lot in those 2 years. And within, I don't know, a few weeks or a month of that, I lost a practice agreement. I had a gestational diabetes clinic, and it was circumstances. The physician was leaving the state. And the only thing I remember about the time, and honestly, full practice authority never really helped me out personally in my practice. It was more I just understood the circumstances. And the only thing I can tell you is that my interest in leading that credentialing review, chairing that committee is because I knew, because I didn't have that job. I was doing something else at the time, but I would no longer have that gestational diabetes clinic. I knew that I would have more time than anybody else in the state to do it. That's it. And I knew I'd find people to help me, and I did.
Could you give us one or two simple things that those of us who are not involved in the political process and who are holding down, 40-hour plus, what can we do to further the cause? There are simple things that we can do but effective.
Most effective, hands down, Do you remember the narratives, the storytelling? You need to meet your legislator, your candidates, tell them who you are and what you do. That's it. Tell them what you do and why it matters in your communities. Those stories, senators repeated those in testimony on the floor. For example, Ginger, who was paying for the licensure of the Colorado psychiatrist, the senators perceived that as absolutely unacceptable. So, again, it's as simple as just getting acquainted with your legislators and telling them what you do and why this is important.
How are we going to get the ability to prescribe Schedule 2s back? Does that fit into any of this anywhere?
Schedule 2s? What do you have here? I don't.
We're 3 through 5, and so we lost hydrocodone when it went with the FDA change.
Okay. I'll tell you some of the best advice handed to us, and I know this is an issue next door in Texas because they told me about it, and we have full prescribing privileges in Nebraska, so my experience is a little different. But some of the best advice came from Senator Glore. We were sitting at the lobbyist drug me along to the Ask dinner where we were going to ask him to lead the legislation. Remember I told you the order of the Ask? Well, he suggested Senator Crawford. He said, no, I can't do it. But our lobbyists knew that we needed to ask him ahead of it. However, Senator Glore is a retired hospital administrator. And we were talking about the bill, and I was citing the no evidence for transition to practice and how we weren't going to include that. And he said, Kathy, he said, you always want to have something in your back pocket. So that was the first. But he said to me, make yourself as small of a target as possible. Now he knows, he's a hospital administrator, okay? He knows what we are up against in terms of the opponents. And so what you want to do in your ask is you want to make it as straightforward and simple as you can. And he said, go back. I know you don't want transition to practice, but you stick that in your back pocket. That becomes a negotiating point. And then you come back some years later, after everybody else has forgotten what the integrated practice agreement was, then you get rid of transition to practice. So the point I'm making there is you may not be able to get everything you want first pass, but you got to go for the big issue. Keep it simple, keep it streamlined, get it done, and then go back. And that was absolutely the very best advice. So we did, heads down, and make yourself as small of a target as possible for the senators. And that's tough. In Nebraska, and I'll tell you another thing, in Nebraska we have that, in terms of prescribing, for some reason, and I don't know why, in Nebraska, nurse practitioners cannot write orders for durable medical equipment for Medicaid recipients. DME, PT, OT, speech path, there's something else in there, medical supplies. And we don't know why. We think it's a pipeline issue, it's an interpretation, it's a tremendous hardship. And it's very annoying, but it's a regulatory issue, it's not legislative. So you have to work those channels, but you can't drag it into the legislative issue. So my best advice is just be patient. That may be something, without knowing the internal workings, that you may have to get next pass.